$5,000 to anyone in this room who can make me tap." Dustin Hale said it the way a man says a thing he already knows the answer to. He stood at the center of the blue competition mat in the Winnipeg Athletic Expo, arms out at his sides, chin up, a billfold thick enough to choke on, tucked into the breast pocket of his rash guard like a prop he had rehearsed with. He was 29 years old, and he had the kind of build that made people step back on sidewalks without knowing why. Three-time provincial grappling champion, 42,000 followers on a platform that did not exist when most of the men in the back rows were raising their kids. He had already put down 4 challengers in the last hour: a firefighter from St. Boniface, a university wrestler who had gone to nationals twice, a corrections officer built like a refrigerator, and a former amateur boxer who had lasted the longest and gone home with a shoulder that would need a week of ice. Each one had stepped up with that same grin, the one that said, "I know this is probably stupid, but let's see," and each one had come back to his chair quieter than he left it. "Come on, Winnipeg." Dustin Hale spread his hands wide and let his voice carry to the back of the room. 5,000, cash. I'll even let you pick the rules." The crowd laughed. They loved him the way a crowd loves a magician, not quite believing, not quite doubting, suspended in the pleasurable discomfort of waiting to be surprised. And from somewhere near the back, close to the folding tables, where local vendors were selling protein supplements and custom mouthguards, and one optimistic fellow had set up a display of hand-carved walking sticks. A man in a flannel shirt raised one hand about chest high and held it there without waving. Dustin Hale found him. His grin did not widen so much as sharpen. "Sir," he pointed with the billfold. "Sir, yes. Come on down. If you have ever sat next to someone on a bus and not looked at them once, not really looked, and then found out afterward who they were and felt the particular shame of that, type lest we forget in the comments right now. Because that feeling is the whole story. That feeling is why we're here." His name was Everett Doyle, and he was 73 years old, and he had come to the Winnipeg Athletic Expo because his granddaughter Nora had a booth 3 rows over selling handmade leather goods, wallets and key fobs and small coin pouches, and she had called him the week before and said, "Grandpa, I just need a warm body there in case I have to use the bathroom." And Everett had driven in from Stonewall in a truck that was older than some of the exhibitors, parked in the far lot because the close one cost $4 more, and spent the morning sitting on a folding chair behind Nora's table, drinking black coffee from a thermos, and reading a battered paperback he had already read twice. He was not a large man. He had been once in the way that men who do hard physical work for decades accumulate a quiet solidity that has nothing to do with a gym. But 73 had taken some of that, the way time takes things. Not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily and without apology. He wore the flannel shirt tucked in, which was a habit, and a pair of dark trousers that had been pressed once but not recently, and boots that had seen more serious ground than a convention center floor. He had white hair cut short and pale eyes that had the particular quality of stillness you sometimes see in people who have spent long stretches of time in places where stillness was the difference between one kind of outcome and another. He walked slowly. His right knee had been replaced 8 years ago, and it worked well enough, but the left hip was still his own, and it reminded him of that fact on cold mornings. And November in Winnipeg is nothing but cold mornings. He carried no cane. He had been offered one after the hip started talking to him, and he had thanked the doctor and left it in the coat closet where it could think about what it was. Nora, from 3 rows over, had seen the hand go up. She had gone very still behind her table. The crowd made a little lane for him as he came down. Some of them were already pulling out phones. 1 or 2 were smiling, the kind of smile. You smile when you think something is about to be unkind, and you have decided to find it funny anyway. Dustin Hale watched him come with professional patience. He was not cruel, not exactly. He had done this long enough to know the crowd needed to believe anyone had a chance, and old men who volunteered were useful theatre. He intended to let him try something, feel him for a half second, and then deposit him gently on the mat with enough care that nobody could accuse him of anything. He had done it before with big men who turned out to be soft, and with young men who turned out to be brittle, and once with a woman in her 60s who had a brown belt and had given him 4 genuinely interesting seconds before he'd closed the distance. He was already composing the joke he would make after. Everett Doyle reached the edge of the mat and stopped. He looked at Dustin Hale the way you look at a clock on the wall, briefly, without urgency, taking in what he needed to know and moving on. "You set the rules," Everett said. "That was all. No preamble, no attempt to seem tougher than he looked. Just you set the rules." Dustin Hale had been doing this for 4 years in front of crowds, and he had heard a lot of opening lines, and that one was new. He blinked once. Then he reset the grin. "Okay," he said. "First one to the mat. No strikes." Everett nodded once, the way you nod when someone tells you the specials, and you have already decided. He did not take off his flannel shirt. He did not shake out his hands, or roll his neck, or do any of the things people do when they want to look like they know what they're doing. He stepped onto the mat in his work boots, which you are technically not supposed to do, and nobody said anything. 300 people went quiet in the way that crowds only go quiet when something has changed, and they don't know yet what it is. Dustin Hale came in low, which was how he always came in, and fast, which was how he preferred to operate. And his left hand reached for Everett's right wrist, and his right hand went for the hip in what is called a body lock entry, and he had hit it roughly 1,000 times in practice, and several hundred in competition, and it had never once failed him in the way that it matters. What happened after that would be debated in the parking lot and on the drive home, and in text messages sent that evening by people who had been in that room, and most of them would not agree on the details, and most of them would be right. Everett Doyle moved. Not away, not laterally. He moved into Dustin Hale's reach, just inside it, a half step that should not have been possible at his pace and with his hip and with his boots on an unfamiliar surface. His right hand did not block, it guided, barely, a degree or two of redirection, the way you adjust the angle of a garden hose, rather than stopping the water. His left hip was suddenly where his right hip had been, and his weight had shifted in a way that physics seemed to permit without enthusiasm. And Dustin Hale's considerable momentum, all of it committed, all of it forward, found nothing where it had aimed, and everything half a meter past that. The younger man went over. He went over completely, and he went over fast, and he went down onto the mat with the full weight of himself and the full weight of his surprise, which was considerable, and the sound of it brought the room back into its own ears all at once. Everett Doyle had not gone down. He was standing where he had been standing, approximately, his boots flat on the mat, his hands at his sides. He was breathing. He looked at the man on the floor with an expression that held nothing that resembled satisfaction. If anything, if you were watching closely, it looked like recognition. The recognition of something old and known, and not particularly pleasant to revisit. He reached down and offered his right hand. The room did not make noise. The room was incapable of noise for a moment. 300 people stood in the particular silence that happens when the thing that was supposed to be impossible has just been demonstrated as ordinary. Dustin Hale lay on his back, staring at the lights in the ceiling of the Winnipeg Convention Center, and he was not hurt, and he knew he was not hurt. And that was somehow not the main fact of the situation. The main fact was a feeling he had never once had in 4 years of doing this. The feeling of having been met, not overpowered, not outmuscled, not lucky countered, but met by something that knew exactly what he was doing before he had finished deciding to do it. He had felt in the 2 seconds that the exchange had lasted that he had been read like a sentence. Not defeated. Passed. He took the hand. He was still sitting when the man in the second row stood up. He was perhaps 65 and wearing a dark blazer over a checked shirt, and he had the posture of a man who had spent decades being the tallest person in rooms where height was measured differently. He was not tall, exactly, but he held himself in a way that added something. His hair was grey going to white, and his face was the face of someone who had been outdoors in serious weather for long periods of time and had come to terms with it. He walked to the edge of the mat with the particular deliberateness of a man who had thought about whether to stand up for a moment, and then made the decision and was at peace with it. "Warrant Officer Doyle," he said. He said it without a microphone, and it reached the back of the room, because some voices have learned not to need amplification. Everett Doyle turned. Something moved through his face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the feeling of stepping around a corner and finding a landscape you had not let yourself think about in a long time. "Colonel Renaud," he said quietly. The man at the edge of the mat looked at the crowd for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the measured quality of someone choosing which words to let out of a larger room. "Some of you may recognize me," he said. "I spent 31 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. I retired as a colonel commanding a Princess Patricia's regiment, and I have been in this city for 11 years since, and I have sat in that row for the last 2 hours telling myself that the man by the craft tables could not possibly be who I thought he was." He paused. "I would like to tell you who that man is." A vendor somewhere turned off a radio. You could hear the heating system in the ceiling. "The gentleman who has just put a 3-time provincial champion on the mat in under 2 seconds is Warrant Officer First Class Everett Gordon Doyle, retired 34 years with the Canadian Army, Joint Task Force 2. Before that, the Airborne Regiment. Before that, basic training at CFB Borden, where his instructors wrote, in their assessments, that he was the most naturally capable close combat trainee they had evaluated in 11 years of instruction. He went on to become one of those instructors, and then one of the men who trained those instructors." Dustin Hale, still sitting on the mat, turned and looked at the old man in the flannel shirt with an expression that had lost everything except attention. But Colonel Renault was not finished. His voice, which had been even until now, went somewhere else. It went somewhere quiet and specific, and the 300 people in that room leaned toward it without meaning to. "I am not standing up because of his record," he said. "I am standing up because of a bridge." He let that sit for a moment. "In September of 2006, in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, I was a major, and I had made a decision that turned out to be wrong. I had taken a 6-vehicle convoy across a crossing that our intelligence said was clear, and it was not clear, and the lead vehicle went first, and that was my vehicle, and when the IED went off, I was conscious, but I was not mobile, and the vehicle was burning, and the secondary was coming." The room had stopped breathing. A warrant officer I had known for 8 months came back through what was coming, not around it, through it. He pulled the driver out first, because the driver was closer to the door. Then he came back for me. I told him to leave me. I told him that is a direct order, and I meant it, and he said something to me that I will not repeat in mixed company, and he picked me up anyway. The colonel's mouth twitched almost. He carried me 40 meters to cover with a concussion and 2 cracked ribs, and what we found out 3 hours later was a gunshot wound through the muscle of his left forearm that he had not mentioned, not during the extraction, not during the debrief. He mentioned it when someone noticed his sleeve. He stopped. He received the Medal of Military Valor. It was presented quietly, the way he wanted everything. He served 6 more years after that and trained 2 generations of JTF-2 candidates in close combat systems that trace, if you follow the lineage of instruction, to the man himself. "Mr. Hale, the techniques you have trained in, if you follow your coaches back far enough, you will find his name." He looked at Dustin Hale directly. "You have been studying his work for years. You met the source just now. If you have ever owed your life to a person who never thought of it as a debt, who folded it up quietly and put it somewhere and went on living like the rest of us, owe them nothing. Type, lest we forget right now. Because that is not a small thing to know about another human being. It is the largest thing there is." The colonel's composure had held through everything, but it did not hold through what came next. "I have 4 grandchildren," he said, "and I have them because of the man in the flannel shirt. And I have spent 18 years trying to find the right thing to say about that, and I have not found it, and I do not think it exists, and I think he knows that, and I think that is partly why he never made it easy to look for him." He looked at Everett directly. "You moved to Stonewall. You are very nearly invisible in Stonewall, Warrant Officer Doyle. You almost succeeded." Everett Doyle had not moved from where he was standing. His hands were still at his sides. His face was doing something careful and contained. He looked at the colonel, the way you look at something you have not allowed yourself to think about until someone puts it in front of you, and then you have to deal with the fact that it's real. "I was doing my job, Michelle," he said, quietly. Not loud enough for the back row, but loud enough for the mat. "No," said the colonel. "That is what you have always believed, and you have always been wrong about it, and I have wanted to tell you so for 18 years. Dustin Hale got to his feet. He had been sitting on the mat through all of it, and he stood up now with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just been given new information about the room he is in and is adjusting accordingly. He stood straight. He did not perform it, he just stood. The crowd found its voice, not all at once, but in the way a room warms, gradually from multiple sources until the whole of it has changed temperature. Dustin Hale reached into his rash guard and took out the billfold. $5,000, which he had packed into that pocket 40 times in 4 years and carried home 40 times in 4 years. He held it out in both hands, flat, not extended, toward Everett's chest, flat at his own waist, like something being offered on a counter. "Sir," he said. He had a good voice, normally, a competition voice, built for projecting confidence. Right now it was doing something different. "I've done this in 11 cities and I've never paid out. I need you to take this." Everett Doyle looked at the money. He looked at the young man holding it. Something in his expression moved through several things and came to rest somewhere gentle. He did not take the billfold. He reached out instead and put one hand on top of Dustin Hale's, not pressing, just resting, the way you settle a restless thing. "There's a youth program," Everett said. "A grappling club out of the North End. They've been running out of mats for 2 years. They do good work with kids who need somewhere to be on Friday nights." He left his hand where it was. "Put it there, not as charity, as investment. Those kids will produce someone better than both of us inside of 10 years. That's the point of the whole business." He paused. "That was always the point." The room came up, not the way a room comes up at the end of a match, not the performed enthusiasm of a crowd that has decided to be impressed. This was slower and came from somewhere below the ribs, and it was 300 people all dealing at the same moment with the same sudden understanding that they had almost missed this, that this man had almost walked back to the thermos and the paperback and the truck in the far lot, and nobody would have known. Colonel Michel Renaud walked onto the mat. He walked without hurry and without ceremony, and he put his arms around Everett Doyle, and he held on with the kind of grip that doesn't have a name in any grappling system because it is not a technique. It is just two people who have been somewhere together that nobody else in the room has been, standing in a place where neither of them has to explain it. Nora, 3 rows over, had abandoned her booth entirely. She was standing at the edge of the crowd with both hands pressed to her mouth. She had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with this man every year of her life and helped him bring in firewood in October and called him when her car wouldn't start in February. And she had known exactly none of this, not one word of it. And she thought about every time she had introduced him to someone and said, "This is my grandfather, he was in the army." The way you say a thing you know to be true, but have never actually looked at. She was looking at it now. Dustin Hale stood at attention for the entire thing. He had learned to do it once, years ago, from a coach who had been a reservist, and he had never had occasion to use it in the way it was meant to be used, and he used it now. He kept his eyes forward and his hands straight, and he did not lower them until the old man turned and looked at him and gave him a small nod that said at ease without using the words. Because a man who spent 34 years in that world does not need the words. They brought a microphone over to Everett afterward. He waved it off the way he had waved off the cane and the closer parking spot, and probably 100 other things over the course of a life organized around the principle that what you need is usually less than what you're offered. He shook a few hands. He let the colonel keep a hold of his arm longer than a handshake needed. He said something to Dustin Hale that was too low for anyone nearby to catch, and Dustin Hale listened and then nodded twice, slowly, like a man writing something down. And then Everett Gordon Doyle, Warrant Officer First Class, retired 34 years, 2 theatres, 1 medal he had not wanted a ceremony for, picked up his thermos from behind Nora's table, found his paperback where he had set it face down next to a coin purse shaped like a maple leaf, and walked back toward the far end of the building the same way he had come. Steady, unhurried, a flannel shirt in a crowd of compression gear and branded quarter zips. An ordinary man in the exact way that the word ordinary cannot hold. He had ended a 4-year undefeated run in under 2 seconds and spent none of the time since thinking about it. He had been shot through the arm while carrying a man out of a burning vehicle and not mentioned it during the debrief. He had trained 2 generations of soldiers in how to bring someone to the ground safely, which is to say, in how to be responsible for another person's body, even when that person is trying to stop you, even when everything is moving fast and nothing is certain. And that is a harder thing to teach than it sounds. He had driven in from Stonewall because his granddaughter needed a warm body at her booth, and he had sat in a folding chair all morning, and he had raised his hand when a young man with a billfold offered $5,000 to anyone who could prove something, and he had proved it, and then he had told the young man what to do with the money. He had not explained himself once. There is a kind of person who takes up a great deal of space by saying very little, who occupies a room most fully by sitting quietly at the edge of it. You may have met one. You may have sat next to one on a bus, or eaten dinner across from one at a table, and smiled and passed the salt and never once thought to ask. The ones who saved the lives that made your life possible are not always wearing the evidence of it. They are often in flannel shirts in the back of rooms that have nothing to do with any of it, drinking bad coffee and waiting patiently for someone who needs them. If this channel is the kind of place you want to find them, one quiet hand raised at a time, one parking lot in Stonewall at a time, then stay. We will keep looking. There are more of them than you think, and most of them would prefer we didn't say so, and that is exactly why we have to.